So in the sense that the history itself hasn't really changed, the manuals didn't change very much. But where it did change was really how that information was presented and in how that information was supplemented. At the time that I was doing this, the most recent resource manual was almost 15 years out of date. They have been produced, there has been another one that's been produced since then, I believe in 2011, so quite a bit later still. But the thing that was happening while they weren't producing new resource manuals was the other manuals, which were the best practices for historical interpretation, the site operations and mechanics manual, and that sort of thing. Some of the early resources that I looked at, so the stuff from the early 80s, had a section called the thorough line of interpretation. And what this means seemed to have changed over time. In 1992, this was a building-by-building review that highlighted key bits of information for each section of St. Marie. But in 1987, it actually looked quite different. And so this is what the thorough line would tell you back in 1987. To the best of the ability of those responsible, the living history program depicted within the walls of the reconstructed mission will be substantiated by 1. Information from the time period making specific reference to St. Marie among the Hurons. 2. Information from the time period making specific reference to Wendat or French lifestyles within the area known as Wendake. 3. Information from the time period prior to 1639 which makes reference to Wendat or French lifestyles within the area known as Wendake and which cannot be disputed by later reference. 4. Information from the period which describes similar lifestyles in France or New France and which can be reasonably and logically transferred to the St. Marie circumstance. 5. Information based on conclusion reached by modern scholars after documented research. 6. Information based on oral records and personal demonstration which describes traditional native life skills relevant to St. Marie. And finally, the last one, which is the really interesting one, information based on any of the above, but which has been modified to meet 20th century social or legal restrictions. And what's particularly interesting about that is that after that 1987 manual, that actually disappears altogether. And this is really kind of the only place in the stuff that I was able to look at where it really spells out that, that you can modify what you're saying in order not to offend people in the present moment. And this plays out in a number of different ways. One of the examples that I find really compelling is that, as I mentioned previously, there were a number of soldiers at St. Marie. They were hired to protect the mission from anybody who might come to try to destroy it. And a lot of people in the area still know the site of St. Marie as the Old Fort. It's actually beside a road called Old Fort Road. But Huronia Historical Parks made a very conscious decision to basically never talk about that part of the history at all. There were originally, or at the height of St. Marie, there were 22 soldiers there, which is a pretty substantial number of people. But 2005 was the very first time that there was actually a soldier position that you could be in out on the site. So up until that point, they had no one costumed as a soldier or portraying a soldier there at St. Marie. That was also the first time that one of the reconstructed buildings, which Jury believed was a soldier's barracks, was actually open to the public. So in the 1988 operations manual, one of the things that it said for the position of greeting priest, which would be right outside the front gates that I showed you at the very beginning of the slideshow, the manual advises that your appearance at the gate to the mission is an immediate attempt to dispel the idea of a fort. So very, very strongly urging people away from that military view of the historic site there. And I think that that's a really interesting choice, given that the vast majority of historic sites in Ontario do tend to be military sites. So separating themselves from basically everything else in Ontario is, I think, potentially a really strong choice in terms of differentiating themselves. One of the other reasons that I think that this happens is that if you maintain the military presence on the historical site, it's very difficult to avoid speaking about the imperial facets of the site, which is something that does not get talked about very much at all. The narrative of conquest, of colonization, is one that's really glossed over for the most part, I think, today. So obviously, whenever you're adapting information, one of the questions that must come up there is the question of authenticity or accuracy. So what kinds of factors affect how the past is portrayed at Ste. Marie? In the Alan Gordon article that I mentioned, he discusses how the environment at Ste. Marie is one that is very much the product of its times. It's a product of pre-centennial patriotic fervor, local civic boosting, and an active attempt to create regional history in Ontario, all of which characterized the national sentiment of the mid-1960s. Into the 21st century, however, the excitement of the centennial is all but forgotten, and Ste. Marie has had to weather political storms and budget cuts, as well as changing social views, all of which have produced major changes in the operation of the site, as well as in the ways that interpretation is thought about. The best example of this is how the development of political correctness led to important changes in how the Huron were portrayed. And one of the people that I interviewed said, "There was a lens of savagery surrounding everything about the Huron. Imagine if we went out in first person using the language that the Jesuits would have, throwing around the opinions that they would have. We'd be crucified." Interpretation at the site has had to change to accommodate how society has changed around it. It reflects what we value. Thus, the accuracy of experience, through both the physical site and through the interpretation itself, at Ste. Marie continues to be influenced more by the present day rather than the past. And although these changes have happened gradually, it's likely that they're the result of contingency decision-making and responses to social paradigm shifts, such as the development of the Canadian Multicultural Act. These changing policies regarding interpretation are often reflected in the volume and type of different manuals that are offered. Whereas in the early 80s, people got a few very basic manuals and an assortment of location-specific manuals, such as blacksmithing or shoemaking, today's interpreter is more likely to be instructed in learning strategies and customer service skills. Where the focus in the site's early years was on historical authenticity, that focus has been expanded and adapted in more recent years. At the start of the 1983 manual, the primary message for Ste. Marie read, "Ste. Marie among the Hurons was a 17th century mission isolated in Wendake, the land of the Hurons. Today it is a heritage center and living history community of national significance." By contrast, if you look at the beginning of the 2005 manual, the vision statement at the beginning says, "Our vision is to become a leading economic tourism stimulator in southern Georgian Bay, committed to creating a memorable experience for all customers through excellence in program delivery at our original historic properties." So really big shift there. This shift in goals is a part of a larger paradigm shift that has left Ste. Marie competing for tourist dollars in an economy that's not really all that favorable to tourism. They can no longer rely on the grandeur of the story or the novelty of the site to attract visitors. After having been a tourist attraction for 40 plus years, the initial rush is long over, and competition with other attractions is inevitable. The officially produced documents are not the only resources that people would have available to them. Many of the people that I spoke with talked about the Jesuit relations and allied documents as a primary source. The relations, which are made up of approximately 71 volumes of letters written by priests, laborers, and nuns, do not deal solely with Ste. Marie, but were rather an annual report prepared for the mission's superiors in Quebec, France, and Rome. In a modern context, the relations need to be read with a critical eye, as the biases that are contained within are easy to spot. Their authors are predominantly male, white, upper class, and European. Understanding how these men thought of themselves is especially important to understanding how their writings are formed. Their impressions of the Huron people, in their own words, would often be quite surprising to a 21st century audience. The events of each year's work are recorded in the letter, usually by the Father Superior of the mission, although occasionally there would be supplementary letters from other people. While writing, the letter's authors were in full knowledge of the fact that these letters might not reach their destinations for up to 2 years, and that responses might take just as long to come back to New France. The emphasis in the letters tends to be on the Aboriginal aspects of New France. The mission at Ste. Marie was probably a fairly secondary concern for both the reader and the writer. The customs of the Huron and the other Aboriginal groups that the French came into contact with, including the Algonquin and the Abenaki, are painstakingly recorded, along with very prosaic descriptions of religious fervor among the newly converted and the gross heresy of those who remained traditional. These letters would later be published in book form in France, and their translations throughout Europe, as the customs and lifestyles of the Aboriginal people were of great interest. The popularity of these books was such that the publisher, Sébastien Cramoisy, who first published the 1632 relation, was able to reissue them annually until 1672, which is a pretty impressive publishing history for the 17th century. As much as the letters of the Jesuit relations were written to inform other Europeans of the bizarre but wondrous place that was New France, they were also written with very specific goals in mind. As mentioned above, the prevalence of these letters meant that they reached a large audience, an audience whose faith in the church could be affirmed by the Jesuit stories. They also served as a way to inform people about the hardships of missionary work. More than that, they could subtly encourage people to become involved in the mission by donating money or goods. Thus, the relations have a very delicate balance to them. They contain a mixture of success and failure. Things couldn't be too successful, because then people wouldn't send money, but they also couldn't be total failures, because then people would ask questions about why they were even doing the missionary work. So much of the other information that you can find about the European aspects of Huronia, I think is quite hagiographic in its delivery, which is probably not surprising given that 8 of the men connected with the mission were martyred and then eventually canonized in the 1930 by Pope Pius XI. But the religious context, because of the religious context involved, it's important to read these things accordingly, as most of the texts are committed to the glorification of the lives of these men, a process which usually involves contrasting them against the other of the Aboriginal. It's not that these accounts are not necessarily factual, but they're written with a very specific end result in mind, and they're very focused in achieving that end. As the Huron were an entirely oral culture when they first encountered the French, the recollections of the Jesuits and of other Europeans in Quebec are often the only written records from this period of their culture. Combined with the triple threat of European disease, famine, and war with the Iroquois, as 90% of the Huron would be destroyed within the first 50 years of European contact, and much of their language would go along with it, although there has been some effort in the late 20th and 21st centuries to revive it. At Ste. Marie, the current emphasis and interpretation is on redressing this idea and accenting Huron contributions to life with the mission, and in Huronia in order to balance how history is presented.